In 1450, a man in Germany paid the equivalent of 6 months' wages, not for land, not for food, not for medicine, but for a piece of paper that promised his dead mother would spend less time in agony. Why did he believe it would work? Because every single person in his world, his priest, his neighbors, his lord, the artists who painted his church walls, the scholars who wrote the books his priest read aloud, every single one of them agreed on where his mother was. They agreed on what she was experiencing, and they agreed that this piece of paper issued by the most powerful institution on earth could change it. That is what we are here to understand, not religion as doctrine, not religion as politics, religion as the operating system of an entire civilization, the thing that told people what was real, what was dangerous, what mattered, and what came next. By the time this video ends, you will not just know what people believed in 1450. You will understand why those beliefs made complete, rational sense, and why they were already beginning to collapse, decades before anyone famous nailed anything to a church door. Let's start with the world itself, because you cannot understand 1,450 beliefs without understanding 1,450 bodies. The Black Death had arrived in Europe roughly 100 years earlier. By the time it finished its first wave, somewhere between a third and half of the entire population of Europe was dead. Not weakened, not displaced, dead. In some cities, Florence, Venice, Hamburg, Rhodes, more than half the people you knew, everyone you had grown up with, were gone within 2 years. And then it came back. It came back in 1361, in 1374, in 1400, in 1438. By 1450, no one alive had spent their entire life without a major outbreak of plague somewhere in their region. Death was not a distant abstraction. It was a rhythm. It was the background noise of every single life. This matters because it shapes everything about what people believed and why they believed it so intensely. When death is that close, when your child, your spouse, your parent can be gone within 3 days of showing symptoms, the question of what happens after death is not philosophical. It is the most urgent, practical question you face. It demands an answer. And in 1450, there was only one institution in Western Europe with the authority to provide one. The Catholic Church was not simply a religious organization. It owned roughly 1/3 of all land in Western Europe. It ran the hospitals, the schools, the orphanages. It recorded births, performed marriages, and buried the dead. There was no civil registry, no public education system, no social safety net that existed outside of it. If you wanted your child baptized, and you did desperately because an unbaptized child who died could not enter heaven, you went to the church. If you wanted last rites, and you did because dying without them was one of the most terrifying things imaginable, you called a priest. From the moment you were born to the moment your body went into the ground, the church was the institution that processed you through life. And it had answers, specific, detailed, geographically precise answers about what came next. Hell was not a vague bad place. It had a structure. Dante had written his Inferno in the early 1300s, and while Dante was a poet, not a theologian, his architecture of hell, 9 circles, each calibrated to a specific sin, each with its own specific torment, had seeped into popular imagination across Europe. Sermons described hell in sensory detail. You would hear the screaming of other souls. You would smell sulfur. You would feel heat beyond anything fire in this world could produce, and you would feel it forever, without the mercy of losing consciousness, without the mercy of growing used to it without end. This was not considered cruel to teach. It was considered necessary, because there was a way out. There was a path that avoided hell entirely, and the church was its custodian. But here is where it gets more complicated and more human. Because most people in 1450 did not expect to go straight to hell. Most people were not murderers or heretics. They were ordinary people who had sinned in ordinary ways, told lies, felt envy, neglected prayer, cheated a neighbor slightly, lost their temper. For those people, the church had developed a concept that was, in its own way, both merciful and extraordinarily useful: purgatory. The idea of purgatory, a place between heaven and hell where souls were purified before entering God's presence, had been officially defined by the Church at the Council of Lyons in 1274. By 1450, it had become one of the most powerful ideas in the history of organized religion, not because of its theology, but because of its economics. Here is what purgatory meant to an ordinary person in 1450. When your mother died, she almost certainly did not go straight to heaven. She was a good woman, but she had sinned. She would go to purgatory, where she would be purified through suffering until she was clean enough to enter God's presence. How long would that take? That depended on how many sins she had committed and how thoroughly she had confessed and done penance for them in life. It could be decades, it could be centuries, it could be longer, and she would be in pain the entire time. But here was the thing, you could help her. You could pay for masses to be said in her name. You could go on pilgrimage. You could give money to the church. You could perform acts of charity. All of these things generated what the church called indulgences, reductions in the time a soul spent in purgatory. And by 1450, the system had evolved to the point where a piece of paper issued by church authorities and purchased for money could transfer an indulgence to a named soul in purgatory. That is what the man in Germany bought. He was not stupid. He was not simply deceived. He was operating within a complete, internally consistent, universally endorsed theological framework that had been developed, refined, and taught by the most educated institution in Europe for over a century. Everyone around him believed the same thing. His priest believed it, the bishop believed it, the pope believed it. The transaction made complete sense. It was an act of love. Now let's talk about what people feared on a more immediate daily level. Because hell and purgatory were the long-term fears. There were shorter-term ones. The devil was not a metaphor in 1450. He was a being. He was active. He moved through the world looking for souls to corrupt and claim. Theologians had spent centuries developing an elaborate demonology, a ranked hierarchy of demonic beings, each with specific powers and specific temptations. This was not fringe theology. This was mainstream, taught from pulpits, depicted on church walls, assumed in everyday speech. When milk went sour for no visible reason, a demonic explanation was as credible as any other. When a child was born with a deformity, when a harvest failed, when a woman began behaving strangely, the demonic framework was available, widely understood, and socially acceptable as an explanation. The great witch trials that we tend to associate with the late 1400s and 1500s were still mostly ahead in 1450, but the theological infrastructure that made them possible was fully built. The Inquisition had existed since the 13th century. The idea that ordinary people could make pacts with demonic forces and use them to harm their neighbors was not a new or fringe belief. It was part of the furniture of the world. Across Europe, church walls were covered in an image called the Danse Macabre, the dance of death. It showed a skeleton, or death personified, leading a procession of figures from every rank of society: a pope, a king, a merchant, a knight, a peasant, a child, all of them being led to the grave equally and inevitably. It appeared in paintings, in manuscripts, in theatrical processions through city streets. Its message was not meant to terrify without purpose. It was a rehearsal. You were supposed to look at it, absorb it, and spend your life preparing for the moment when death came for you personally. Because it would, and probably sooner than you expected. But here is what gets lost when we talk about 1450 religion only through the lens of fear. The fear was real, but it was not the whole picture. For most ordinary people, faith was also the primary source of comfort, community, and meaning in a life that was otherwise defined by physical hardship and radical uncertainty. The liturgical calendar gave shape to the year: Advent, Christmas, Lent, Easter, the feast days of dozens of saints. These were not just religious obligations, they were the organizing structure of time itself. They told you when to fast and when to feast, when to work and when to rest, when to gather and when to reflect. In a world without newspapers, without public clocks on every corner, without the concept of a weekend, the church calendar was the rhythm of life. Saints were not distant holy figures. They were intercessors, something closer to trusted advocates with direct access to God. Each saint had a domain, Saint Sebastian protected against plague. Saint Anthony helped you find lost objects. Saint Barbara was the one you prayed to for a good death, specifically for the grace to receive last rites before you died, which was desperately important. People addressed saints in direct conversational prayer. They made deals with them. I will go on pilgrimage to your shrine if you help my son recover. This was not considered superstitious. It was how the system worked. Pilgrimage was one of the most widespread religious practices in Europe. Canterbury in England, Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Rome, Jerusalem. These destinations drew hundreds of thousands of people every year, on foot, over months. The journey itself was understood as spiritually purifying. The physical difficulty was part of the point, and the social reality of pilgrimage, which Geoffrey Chaucer had captured brilliantly in his Canterbury Tales 60 years earlier, was that it was also one of the few occasions when people from completely different social backgrounds traveled together, told stories, argued, fell in love, and behaved badly. Faith and very human complexity, traveling together down the same road. Now we return to the dangerous part. By 1450, the church that held all of this together, the institution that people depended on for salvation, for meaning, for social order, had just emerged from 40 years of institutional catastrophe. From 1378 to 1417, the Catholic Church had experienced what historians call the Great Schism. At one point, there were 3 men simultaneously claiming to be the legitimate pope. 3 men, each with their own court, their own administration, each excommunicating the others, each claiming to hold the keys to salvation. For 40 years, the average person in Europe had to make a decision, consciously or unconsciously, about which pope's sacraments were valid, which emerged ye. Which baptisms counted, which last rites worked, which confessions had actually been heard by God. The schism had been resolved, technically, by 1417, but the damage it did to the Church's claim to singular, unquestionable authority was not so easily repaired. The selling of indulgences, which had seemed reasonable within the system, was increasingly looking to educated observers like a straightforward financial transaction dressed in theological language. Satire about corrupt clergy was everywhere in 1450. It was not new. Chaucer had written some of the sharpest clerical satire in European history back in the 1390s. But by 1450, the resentment had a sharper edge. People who had paid for masses, bought indulgences, gone on pilgrimage, and watched their children die anyway, watched plague return anyway, watched the church fight itself for 4 decades. Some of them were quietly, carefully beginning to wonder. There was already a movement that had a name for what they were looking for. The Devotio Moderna, the modern devotion, had begun in the Netherlands in the late 1300s and had been spreading quietly across Northern Europe. It emphasized personal, interior faith over institutional ceremony. It said that closeness to God came from reading Scripture yourself, from meditation, from a genuine inner life. Not from purchasing papers or attending the correct rituals, Darcy. Its most influential text, The Imitation of Christ, written by Thomas à Kempis around 1427, had become one of the most copied books in Europe. It was passed hand to hand, read in private, treasured. It asked a question that the institutional church found threatening. What if the ceremonies were less important than the sincerity? Jan Hus, a Bohemian theologian who had asked that question out loud and at volume, had been burned alive at the Council of Constance in 1415, just 35 years before our date. His execution had not ended the question. It had made it more urgent. And in a workshop in Mainz, Germany, in approximately 1450, a craftsman named Johannes Gutenberg was finishing work on a machine that would make it impossible to burn the question fast enough. The printing press was almost ready. The Bible would be printed in 1455. Within 50 years, ideas that had previously spread at the speed of a monk copying manuscripts would spread at the speed of commerce. The theological fractures that were quietly spreading through 1450 Europe would, within a single lifetime, become the Reformation. The man in Germany who bought that piece of paper for his mother was not foolish. He was not primitive. He was a person living inside a complete system of belief that had answered humanity's hardest questions. What happens when we die? How do we live well? How do we bear loss? With confidence and consistency for over 1,000 years. The system was giving its first barely audible cracks in 1450, but he could not hear them yet. What he could hear was a priest reading the name of his mother aloud in a church that smelled of incense and candle smoke before a painted Christ whose eyes seemed to follow you across the room. And for that moment, for the length of that prayer, he believed completely and without doubt that somewhere in the geography of the afterlife her suffering was less than it had been the day before. That is what religion was in 1450. Not just doctrine, not just fear. It was the only vocabulary people had for love across the boundary of death. Understanding that doesn't just tell you about the 15th century. It tells you something about what it means to be human in a world you cannot fully explain.